A vast complex at the ends of the earth.
No one wanted to end up here. And if you did, it was likely you would never leave.
A deserted outpost lost in a freezing landscape.
The amount of engineering effort that needed to go into sustaining the workforce went above and beyond what was necessary.
The battered remains of a monumental project built in a dangerous place.
You've got the constant and unrelenting pressure from the ocean.
And the ruins of a notorious regime's chilling prototype.
It's strange, it's weird. Why would somebody put this much cement in the middle of the woods?
Some are engineering marvels now abandoned. Others are ruins shrouded in mystery. Within these decaying structures are the echoes of history. Some are associated with dark times, but they also remind us of human ingenuity and endeavor. Each haunted shell is ready to be unmasked to tell its own unique story. In the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, which lies in the Arctic Ocean, there's a strange-looking town with an almost supernatural atmosphere.
To find something on this scale, it's amazing.
Everything seems to be in pretty good condition. It's all very well built, but what strikes you is the backdrop to this town is this quite strange-looking pyramid-shaped mountain, and it gives the whole place a kind of mystical feel.
The breathtaking scenery has a savage beauty.
This is miles away from any other kinds of civilization. It's subjected to such brutal environmental conditions.
This is quite a dangerous place to be, cut off from the rest of the world. Freezing temperatures and long, dark winters.
The harsh conditions here would probably scare off most people. But this was clearly no ordinary settlement.
There was something more to this town than just functionality. There was a certain air of grandiosity or showiness.
It's engineered, it's built, it's decorated. The piano is waiting to be played. All that is lacking is a population.
So why build such an elaborate-looking town miles from anywhere? And why is it now abandoned? For almost a century, the islands of Svalbard have been a part of Norway. But almost everything on show here suggests a foreign country was actually in control.
Everywhere you look, there's a flavor and a really strong hint of the Soviet Union, down to the signs, the architecture, and the bust of Lenin in the town's central square.
It's astonishing to see the head of Lenin still looking boldly across a town, just as though the Berlin Wall never fell.
Named after the strange-shaped mountain that looms over the buildings, this is the Soviet town of Pyramiden. At its peak, this was home to more than 1,000 people. Today, just a handful of volunteers like Galina Nosichenko tend the site. But in fact, they're not alone.
It's strange for some people and can be scared for some, very interesting, very curious for others.
Even though the people have left, the town often sees some quite dangerous visitors.
Now it's kind of danger with polar bears, and now it's more than before, because mostly it's quiet and it's better for polar bears to come here. It's easier.
So what was it that made people come all the way out here to live? In the beginning at least, the answer lay underground. Coal.
There were lots of countries that were interested in this place because of the coal. But when you weighed up all the options, many people thought it wasn't worth it. But the Soviets felt it was.
It's such an incredibly inhospitable environment to live in, let alone mining. How do you create a settlement there and turn a profit?
The USSR first obtained mining rights here in 1927. And by the middle of the century, during the Cold War era, it was pouring money into the town. But the extravagance and opulence suggests there were other reasons for the huge investment.
As an engineering project, it wasn't just the basic necessities. There was a level of luxury to this place that suggested that there were other reasons for being here.
They don't only bring coal mining equipment and sheds. They build first-rate accommodation for everybody. They make it so that it's easier to live at this mining station in Svalbard than it is to live in the USSR itself.
They put a lot of stuff for culture life and for sport life also, as a swimming pool, as culture center, as sport field inside culture center. It was very nice for people.
Located over 700 miles from the USSR, the excellent facilities here were far superior to any other mining town behind the Iron Curtain. The coal, then, was not the only reason the Soviets were here.
Some people believe that there was never enough coal there to sustain a prosperous town and community, and that in fact its real purpose all along was to gain a foothold in the West.
During the tense standoff and stalemate of the Cold War, the Soviets were looking for any opportunity to gain access to the West. Since the expansion of the communist territories after the Second World War, mistrust between Russia and the USA was at an all-time high. It was an ideological war, where both sides raced for nuclear and technological superiority. Throughout the world, the two superpowers began exerting their influence over smaller countries, like Svalbard, that might be used for espionage or as a launch base for nuclear missiles. Knowing that an all-out war would lead to nuclear oblivion, the battle for political influence over these proxy countries became a key battleground in the Cold War, as both sides sought to convince the world that their very different political systems were superior. But this place wasn't built for spying or for the military. This was something different.
This was an opportunity for propaganda, an opportunity to showcase to the West, in the West, how communism actually worked.
Building a showpiece city in Svalbard meant that on Norwegian territory, in a place theoretically visible to the entire world, everything that was the best about the Soviet Union could be put on display.
While the money and support lasted, Pyramiden was a beacon of communism. But when the Iron Curtain finally lifted in 1991, reality began to bite.
The original threat caught up with this place. To get to the lucrative coal, you had to dig deeper, and it just wasn't worth it in the end.
The mine was already in a slow decline then, when a disastrous event involving many of the town's citizens came to speed its end.
Tragically, in 1996, a plane flying from Moscow crashed on descent to the island.
Searchers say wreckage is spread across the top of Opera Mountain, and there's speculation they may have been trying to keep below the cloud cover.
In total, 141 people lost their lives.
The community never recovered from this disaster.
The last ton of coal was finally extracted on March the 31st, 1998. And the last inhabitants left the town for good.
What Pyramiden shows us is that you can pour a huge amount of money into an engineering ambition, but if that engineering ambition doesn't support itself, it will eventually disintegrate.
On the west coast of the USA, in the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge, is a rocky bay covered with bizarre remains.
You see this ruin here, you have no idea how old it is. If you were in the Mediterranean, you might think it dates back to the time of the Romans.
This place is intriguing. At first glance, you just see these weather-beaten concrete foundations. The more you look, the more you see.
It's clearly something that's been built in and around using the landscape as part of it. But why was that?
This eerie debris extends beyond the cliff tops. Beneath the rocky shoreline, a series of basins emerge from the waves.
This thing is huge. This is not just one little pool. This covers an area of about 2 acres.
I mean, it makes you wonder whether it's something to do with ships, some sort of boatyardy type thing.
Was it some kind of fish farm or an aquarium?
What was it all for? And why would an area like this, right on the edge of the ocean, be chosen for such a huge complex?
There was obviously a reason why they chose that location, that the sea obviously played an important role in this building. But building that close to the sea is always going to give you trouble.
This coastline construction would have to face the full force of the mighty Pacific. But that was just one of the dangers it faced. A 100 years ago, this place was full of people from nearby San Francisco. In the 19th century, the city was booming, and its growing population had money to spend on leisure and enjoyment. One businessman spotted an opportunity. Millionaire engineer Adolf Sutro bought the land known as Naiad Cove in 1881.
Pacific coast near San Francisco is very rocky with high surf. Sutro noticed that there were a lot of tide pools, and the waves would wash up on the rocks and then flow down. That gave him an idea. What if he took some of these natural tide pools and connected them to a larger man-made pool? He could turn that into an aquarium.
The first step was to build a basin to collect seawater. As local historian John Martini explains.
This is where it all began, at the very tip of Point Lobos, furthest west point in San Francisco. The workers blasted away the tip of the point, and they created this basin they called the wave catch basin.
A hidden tunnel carried that water using just gravity to a tank inland, where spectators could observe the sea creatures within it. But to construct something so sophisticated on the edge of a cliff would be a huge challenge.
This was a very dangerous place to work. You're literally at the edge of the ocean. They could only work at low tide.
And the elements weren't the only threat to this ambitious plan. One night, something washed up nearby that would endanger the whole enterprise, and that could have put an end to Sutro's dreams.
We're inside the walls of the original aquarium. This collapsed section reflects the damage that occurred when a sailing ship loaded with dynamite wrecked on the point right out there. And shortly after midnight, it blew up with a monstrous explosion. A huge piece of the ship was sent sailing through the wall of the aquarium.
With the site not yet completed, it could have been a disaster. But in fact, Sutro used it as an opportunity to expand his vision.
What Sutro had learned from this is that he'd come up with this system where he could work with the tides to fill up pools further inland. And that sparked his imagination.
He decided he wanted something more. He wanted a place where people could actually swim.
The plan Sutro was forming was something on a scale never seen before.
Sutro's plan was audacious. His word for it was pretentious. The idea was to build a set of swimming pools fed by the ocean, but covered under glass like a giant greenhouse.
These are the remains of the Sutro Baths. Sutro envisaged a grand cathedral-like structure on the shore, enclosed in 100,000 square feet of glass. As well as seawater pools, the complex would include over 500 changing rooms, 7 slides, and a grand sweeping staircase. But could Sutro's epic plan be made into a reality?
You're building a structure that has to sort of deal with large waves, small waves, depending on what the ocean's doing. So it's a real interface between engineering and nature that was being attempted here. Who was going to win?
Building so close to the ocean meant nothing could be taken for granted. The derelict ruins would suggest that things didn't go to plan.
Sutro made several attempts to contain his pool, and at first they kept getting washed away by the storms.
It was only with the construction of a monumental concrete wall, 9 feet deep and 285 feet long, that workers were able to begin building the rest of the complex.
It wasn't just a single big pool. It was subdivided. There were 5 smaller pools, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that were heated to different temperatures. The warmest one was the one that was right behind me, which was closest to the powerhouse.
5 boilers heated up to 2 million gallons of water brought in from the ocean, which was then released into the different pools. Overall, the building was able to accommodate up to 10,000 people. Sutro had created the world's largest indoor swimming baths.
When the Sutro Baths opened in 1894, people were just overwhelmed. The scale of the place was just so huge. Adolf Sutro said that Union Square in San Francisco, the big downtown park, could fit inside this building.
It wasn't just a pool, it was an amphitheater. He knew that not everyone would want to swim. Some people just came and watched the swimmers. So he had rows and rows of seats. The entire place was decorated like some kind of lovely fantasy land. Sutro did nothing halfway.
Not only was it beautiful, but it was also ingenious. When the tide was high, the water would come into the bath, and then obviously when the tide became low, it would take the water with it. And in that way, he had built a self-regulating swimming pool that would refresh with the tides twice every day.
The baths were a great success. So why is there so little left of them today?
This building did not have an easy life. It's on the coast, so it was battered by storms.
And although they didn't know it yet, it's one of the world's most dangerous areas in terms of earthquakes.
The west coast city of San Francisco was struck by a violent earthquake in 1906.
Although it lasted less than a minute, 75% of the city was destroyed, but not the Sutro Baths. They survived an earthquake. So what was it that brought about their end?
This beautiful building that had been able to withstand an earthquake, but also decades of being that close to the sea, was finally destroyed in a bizarre twist of fate by fire.
In 1966, a fire broke out here. Fanned by strong winds, it quickly turned into a raging inferno. And within hours, the once magnificent baths were razed to the ground.
It's often the thing around the corner that you're not expecting that leads to the demise and end of what were really quite fantastical ideas that someone put into an engineering masterpiece.
Today, the site is maintained by the National Parks Service. And although they're long gone, the baths still fascinate people.
As one person said, San Francisco's a very young city. We don't have a lot of ruins. But by God, these are our ruins. And every day, hundreds, if not thousands of people are crawling around, basically trying to figure out, what was this place?
On the southern tip of Australia, on the island of Tasmania, is a collection of imposing buildings.
At first glance, this looks like a grand site, a royal or aristocratic home, but there's more here that meets the eye.
In all of this lush vegetation, to see what looks like a created ruin of a medieval abbey with all of its dormitories and workshops and church, it's a little bit strange.
It's a bewildering mix of buildings, different sizes and shapes.
It looks as if it might have had some factory or warehouse purpose. There's even a feeling of something slightly sinister about it. It doesn't quite, as a building in an ensemble, make sense.
It really feels like you're at the very edge of the world. You get the sense that whoever designed this place wanted to isolate its population from everyone else.
Why build such a diverse group of structures in this far-flung location? Behind their grand facades, these buildings hide a darker purpose.
It's odd how only a few dilapidated buildings can take a gorgeous scene of beautiful countryside and turn it into something that feels as though there's deep human misery involved.
This became one of the most feared places in the region.
No one wanted to end up here, and if you did, it was likely you would never leave.
Why did this remote place strike terror into the hearts of all who knew it? Although the buildings are on the edge of the southern hemisphere, their roots lay 10,000 miles away in Britain. In the 18th century, new punishments for crimes were being introduced, and the British courts began sentencing convicts to transportation to the country's new colonies.
Because people were starting to view capital punishment as unfair and inhumane, instead of hanging people who were repeat offenders or serious criminals, we'd just send them away.
Originally, the eastern seaboard of America was the destination of choice for Britain's prisoners. They would send them to penal colonies there, such as that in what became the state of Georgia.
But that system was forced to change after 1783.
After the American War of Independence, Britain had to completely rethink its penal policy, as it could no longer send convicts there. So in that new world, Australia became the epicenter of its deportation program, and some of the worst offenders from the British Empire were sent to Australia.
In 1770, British explorer Captain Cook had landed in Botany Bay, christening it New South Wales. Transportation to Australia began just 18 years later. And the authorities weren't exactly short of people to deport. The urbanization of Britain, especially during the Industrial Revolution, saw crimes, both petty and serious, sharply increase.
Eventually, this new location would hold over 165,000 people from across the British Empire, becoming, effectively, the Empire's largest prison.
Before long, penal colonies had been established all across this vast southern continent. And here in Tasmania was the largest and most infamous of them all, Port Arthur.
It was designed to be escape-proof. There was only one passage to the mainland, and the water was full of sharks. And that one passage to the mainland had fences, armed guards, and even half-starved dogs to ensure security.
Located on a remote peninsula surrounded on three sides by water, the Port Arthur penal colony held 9,000 of the British Empire's most dangerous prisoners.
Port Arthur became notorious for two sorts of offenders. Repeat offenders, those who willingly chose not to be reformed and continued their life of crime, and those who committed some of the most heinous offenses.
This place is an idealistic settlement for prisoners. And the idea is that we'll allow the prisoners, through work, to redeem themselves.
This was the site of a giant experiment which tested out a cutting-edge approach to criminal justice.
One of the driving ideas of this new thinking was productivity, the idea that if people could be made to be useful, then they would feel some purpose. So in addition to being a prison facility, it also became, in a very major sense, a production site.
Port Arthur was an industrial prison, where convicts were used for forced labor. For the prisoners who cut timber, built ships, and ground grain, conditions were harsh. One of the worst jobs was in the flour mill, as historical archaeologist Richard Tuffin explains.
So this ward that we're looking at is the treadwheel ward. This is where there was a big wheel, and that had 56 men on it at any one time. And they would be turning the wheel and grinding the grain. These guys were doing thousands of steps per day. So it was an incredibly harsh punishment. You also have this economic element, as they are just grinding the grain, making the flour that is going into the rations for the convicts.
But the Port Arthur system didn't just involve physical punishment. Central to the rehabilitation of the prisoners was psychological treatment.
Behind this new thinking were the ideas of one man in particular, Jeremy Bentham, who urged the world to think that beatings and floggings only entrenched criminal behavior and that the world had to find another way to try and deal with, minimize, and repurpose criminals.
This might have been seen as a softening of the system. But the new rehabilitation methods were just as extreme. At the edge of the colony is the building known as the separate prison.
This facility is for the people who are too rough for the regular prisoners in Tasmania. In this facility, the prisoners are kept under constant observation, in solitary confinement, in thick-walled cells.
Prisoners wore hoods. They weren't allowed to communicate with other prisoners.
It was a psychologically brutal system. They were locked up for 23 hours a day in isolation, and total silence was imposed on them at all times.
This is the solitary punishment cell of the separate prison. So whilst convicts would be kept in the cells for 23 hours in the separate prison, those who continued to misbehave would be brought into this cell, which was a punishment cell in solitary confinement. They would be in here up to 48 hours on bread and water. There were 4 doors, very thick walls. No one could hear them scream out if they were in this place. And what they would do is shut the doors and they would be left in the dark.
To encourage the convicts to reflect on their crimes, silence and isolation were enforced everywhere.
The prisoners are sent to church for their improvement. Obvious thing to do. But we don't want the prisoners to see each other. So their church pews are built as little stalls. They can see the minister, they can listen to the sermon, but they can't look at or listen to the other prisoners.
It's hard to imagine a more dramatic stripping away of identity, of sense of self. You must have felt that you were truly alone in the world.
So what became of the convicts who were sent to Port Arthur?
Some of these prisoners survived and were trained as craftsmen and became part of the permanent population of the colony.
For those who weren't so lucky, there was a cemetery on the campus as well, known as the Isle of the Dead, and over 1,000 convicts are known to be buried there, the vast majority in unmarked graves.
Transportation from Britain was ended in the 1850s, and in 1877, Australia's largest and most infamous prison was closed down. But Port Arthur quickly got a new lease of life.
As soon as it closed, the public flocked in as tourists, eager to see and experience what the convicts had been put through.
The historic site was turned into a popular open-air museum, and Port Arthur reverted to being a peaceful corner of Tasmania. But one last act of terrible savagery would take place there.
In 1996, Port Arthur became the site of the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history.
35 people were killed by a lone gunman. The atrocity shook Australia to the core. Within 4 months, the government put major gun reform in place, and automatic and semi-automatic weapons were banned.
Gun laws were imposed, and over 1 million weapons were handed in to the Australian government and destroyed.
The massacre at Port Arthur had changed Australia forever. Today, it's one of Australia's most important historic sites. But the grim memories of the suffering that took place here remain. In the steep hills of southern Germany, outside the Bavarian city of Nuremberg, lie the overgrown remains of a monumental construction project.
If you're going through an ancient, sacred forest, last thing you expect is for the woods to end, where someone has scraped away the forest and left almost no trees behind.
The forest is littered with solid lumps of stone.
If I saw this in a town, I'd think I was looking at the ruins of a building that had been demolished.
What you're saying makes you think of ruins of ancient Roman or Greek cities that you might find in Asia Minor. What was once the agora or acropolis of a city.
But this site has a dark past which is linked to an evil regime's epic plans.
The layout of these blocks suggests that this was part of something that could be much larger.
Does the unique situation of these structures hint at why they were built? They are dispersed over an almost vertical slope.
When you stumble across them, you kind of wonder what the purpose of this stepped formation up a hill was for.
It's strange, it's weird. Why would somebody put this much cement in the middle of the woods?
The story begins 20 miles west of these neglected ruins, in Nuremberg, a city that was central to the Nazi vision of Adolf Hitler. The Nazification of Germany began in 1934, when, after the death of President Paul von Hindenburg, Hitler combined the offices and powers of the Chancellery and the presidency, and a national referendum confirmed him as Führer. In a country battered by the Great Depression, Hitler ended the scourge of mass unemployment through a program of extensive public works, which famously included the construction of the autobahns, and by enormously increasing military spending.
When the Nazis start to have their great big political pep rallies, they have them in Nuremberg. The Nazi Party developed the idea of Nuremberg as almost the capital of the Aryan race.
It made the regime increasingly popular. A seemingly endless tide of pro-Nazi propaganda orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels rammed home the message to the public. Slowly but surely, the insidious evils of the Nazi creed began to take hold of Germany. It was helped by the fiery oratory of Hitler himself, and the mass rallies which were held at Nuremberg became powerful and frightening symbols of Nazi might.
Hitler loved his German history and as a German nationalist. By making Nuremberg the center for the Nazi Party rallies and days, he is hearkening back very, very directly to the First Reich, which lasted 1,000 years and which created the German nation.
Nuremberg was the most important stage to present the Nazi Party. And it was the central cultic space for the Nazi movement. They wanted to show the whole world, and the Germans too, that they are a movement who can speak for the whole people. There's one leader, and the people stands behind him.
To show the world that the Third Reich intended dominating Europe forever, Hitler ordered a complex of grand edifices that glorified the Nazi regime to be built. The final building was to be a national stadium of truly epic scale.
The ambition for this project was to create a massive auditorium space that could house 405,000 people.
This was going to be a stadium as big as the 4 largest stadiums in the United States today. No stadium in the world has ever been as big as this new German stadium was going to be.
But first, it had to be built. The vast scale of the Deutsches Stadion, or German stadium, would be a challenge for Nazi architect and close ally of Hitler, Albert Speer.
To be able to create a structure like this was a real statement of power and dominance and authority.
But what does this have to do with the concrete ruins on the hill in the woods 20 miles from Nuremberg? Speer realized that to build the stadium, he would first need a prototype. Historian Dr. Alexander Schmidt has investigated the site.
What we have here is a concrete wall. It's part of the foundation of the whole wooden construction for the visitor benches. You have to imagine that there are long benches for the visitors, and the hill is without any tree, so you have a free side to the bottom.
In 1937, work began on a life-size model. And this was the test site.
In the Nazi times, you have here a realistic 1-to-1 scale model of the biggest stadium of the world.
It was important to test out the concept of building such an enormous stadium, look at things like sight lines and seating. But if they'd had to build all of the structures that would have to hold up the new German stadium, it would have taken forever, and it would have used way too much material. So what the Germans did was they found a hill that was just the right angle to simulate the angle that they wanted the stadium to be at when they finished it.
Building a scale model allows you to improve the design, but building on an actual test site allows you to really experience what it would be like.
For 18 months, hundreds of workers labored to construct this enormous prototype. The end result was 5 levels of bleachers capable of holding thousands of people. But only one person could sign off on the final design.
Albert Speer comes with Hitler and he needs his permission to go on. And Hitler was only here one day on this 21 March of 1938. Hitler said, okay, we do it.
The sinister reason behind Hitler's determination to construct such a vast stadium lies in his plans for world domination. When it was completed, the German stadium in Nuremberg would provide the perfect location to demonstrate the unrivaled strength of the Reich.
Nazi ideology requires eternal war. The Aryan race has got to keep on fighting in order to perfect itself.
This is the concept from the beginning. If you wanted a war against the whole world, then you have to have soldiers.
Once they conquered all of the surrounding nations, once they killed all of the Jews and Gypsies and Russians and everybody, what would they do to continue to fight? They would hold life and death war games where they came together in this massive stadium for the pleasure of the German people and the continued improvement of the Aryan race.
This stadium was the place to celebrate this aim. You only are a good German if you can fight as a young man.
But these ruins are all that remain of this terrifying vision of Aryan dominance. When war broke out, the building of the stadium in Nuremberg was put on hold, and then, eventually, abandoned. Today, the concrete foundations are being reclaimed by nature. Ironically, the wooden bleachers that once stood here have since helped repair some of the damage caused by the Nazi regime.
The wood here is, after the war, used for rebuilding a little village here nearby. Achtel was destroyed in the end of the war. And this is a very better use for this wood than for a senseless one-to-one scale of the German stadium.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes of history within these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.